What if I told you that 500 years ago people survived winters so brutal they would kill most of us today without the things we consider essential for survival? What if I told you they did it without wool coats, without heated homes, sometimes without fire itself? And yet they not only lived but built thriving communities that lasted for generations. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where winter wasn't just cold, it was a living adversary that tested every breath, every heartbeat, every quiet moment of endurance. Before we step into this quiet journey through winter's hold on the early peoples of North America, I'd love a small favor. Tap the like button if your heart is ready to wander back in time with me tonight. Be sure to subscribe so you'll always be part of these late-night passages into history's forgotten corners. Leave a comment, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Some of you may be awake in the stillness of night, others just beginning your morning, or somewhere in between. Because trust me, what comes next is a story you won't want to miss. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum, and let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. We're traveling back to the Northern Plains and Great Lakes region, sometime around the year 1450. The Haudenosaunee, the Lakota, the Ojibwe, dozens of nations living in harmony with seasons that could be merciless. This was a world before European trade brought metal tools and wool blankets, before horses, before guns, a world where survival depended entirely on what the land could provide and what human ingenuity could create from bark, hide, and bone. Winter here wasn't just a season, it was a test of everything you knew about staying alive. Let us begin with you. Not as an observer, but as someone who lived it. Someone who woke each morning not knowing if spring would ever come. You wake, and immediately you know something is wrong with your body. Your breath emerges in small white puffs that dissipate quickly in the bitter air. The sensation isn't pleasant, it's the sharp reminder that the warmth you carried into sleep has leached away, stolen by the patient cold that never sleeps. Your joints feel stiff, as though someone has replaced your bones with frozen wood. Moving your fingers requires conscious effort. The buffalo hide that covered you during the night feels heavy and cold against your skin, having absorbed the chill from the earth beneath. Around you, others stir with the same reluctance. No one speaks yet. Speaking requires energy, and energy must be rationed like food, like warmth, like hope. The shelter above you, if you can call it that, consists of branches woven together with sinew, covered by whatever hides your family managed to prepare before the deep cold arrived. It keeps the wind from cutting directly through you, but it doesn't keep the cold out. Cold seeps. Cold finds every gap, every loose weave, every place where breath has created the smallest pocket of warmth. This is your home for the winter. Not by choice, but because the permanent village is a 3 days walk away, and those 3 days might as well be 300 when snow lies waist deep and the wind carries ice crystals that cut exposed skin like tiny knives. You lie still for a moment longer, listening to the sounds of winter. The wind, always the wind, creating its own language as it moves through bare branches. Somewhere, far off, you hear the crack of a tree splitting in the cold, a sound like thunder, but sharper, more immediate. It reminds you that winter breaks things. Trees, bones, spirits if you let it. Rising means leaving whatever small warmth you've managed to preserve through the night. There's no fire this morning. There was no dry wood yesterday, and the tinder grew damp despite your best efforts to keep it protected. Fire, when it comes, will have to be earned through patient work, scraping bark, finding the driest wood possible, coaxing spark into flame with hands that barely have feeling left in them. But first, you must dress for survival. This doesn't mean pulling on a wool coat or leather boots. Instead, you begin the careful process of layering that will determine whether you live through another day. First, the innermost layer, soft dough skin, worked until it feels like cloth, worn smooth by your mother's hands and your grandmother's before that. It fits close against your skin, but it's thin. Beautiful, but thin. Next comes a heavier hide, this one with the hair still attached. Elk, if your family was fortunate during the autumn hunts. Buffalo, if you were blessed by abundance. But more likely deer or even rabbit skins sewn together, dozens of them creating a patchwork garment that rustles softly when you move. The outer layer is your armor against the wind. Bare hide, thick and dark, the hair coarse beneath your hands. It's heavy. So heavy that wearing it requires a different way of moving, a different way of breathing, but it turns the wind, and turning the wind means the difference between surviving until evening and becoming another story of winter's hunger. Your feet present their own challenge. Moccasins, lined with grass you gathered before the first freeze, stuffed with fur from small animals caught in better times. They're beautiful in their way, crafted with skills passed down through generations. But they're not waterproof. They're not insulated like modern boots. They're simply the best that human hands can create from what the natural world provides. Each step requires thought. Where will your foot land? Is that white surface snow that will support you? Or is it hiding a depression that will plunge you knee-deep into cold that will soak through your footwear in moments? Stepping outside means entering a landscape that barely resembles the world you knew in autumn. Snow has transformed everything, creating a uniformity that can be beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The familiar paths are gone, buried under drifts that reshape themselves with each wind. The berry bushes where you gathered food just months ago are now mysterious mounds of white, their bounty preserved somewhere beneath the surface, but impossibly out of reach. The cold here is different from what people experience today. It's not the cold of stepping from a heated house to a heated car. It's the cold of knowing that there is no warmth waiting for you except what you can create with your own hands, your own breath, your own carefully rationed energy. It settles into your bones with a patience that feels almost deliberate. First, your fingers begin to lose sensation, not all at once, but gradually like a slow tide retreating. Then your toes growing distant and disconnected from your conscious control. The cold works its way inward, claiming territory bit by bit. Your face feels the bite immediately. The skin tightens and you learn to breathe through your nose to warm the air before it reaches your lungs. Breathing through your mouth brings the cold directly inside your body, creating an ache that spreads through your chest. But perhaps most challenging is what the cold does to your mind. Thinking becomes harder. Not impossible, but slower, as though your thoughts must travel through thick syrup to reach consciousness. Decisions that would be simple in warmth, which direction to walk, whether to rest, how to position yourself to conserve energy, require deliberate effort. Finding fuel for fire becomes the day's primary quest, but it's a quest that offers no guarantees. The obvious choices, fallen branches, dead wood, have been exposed to months of snow and rain. They're waterlogged, frozen solid, and more likely to extinguish a fire than feed it. You must think like winter itself, understanding where the cold has been kind enough to leave pockets of dry material. Beneath larger trees sometimes, where the canopy has created a small shelter. Inside, hollow logs that haven't yet succumbed completely to rot. Under overhanging rocks where snow hasn't penetrated. But even when you find dry wood, the process of creating fire requires tools that make the task exponentially more difficult than it would be today. No matches, no lighters, no convenient bundles of newspaper for kindling. Instead, you work with flint and steel if you're fortunate, or flint and tinder fungus, striking spark after spark into material that must be perfectly prepared to catch and hold a flame. Your hands, already stiff with cold, must perform delicate work. Too much force and you'll scatter your carefully gathered tinder. Too little and the spark will die before it can take hold. And all of this while the wind searches for ways to steal your efforts, and the cold makes your fingers clumsy and unresponsive. Sometimes fire simply doesn't come. Sometimes you must accept that this will be a night without warmth, a night of enduring rather than comfort. These are the nights that test not just your body, but your spirit's capacity to believe that morning will eventually arrive. Food in winter becomes something different from what it is during seasons of abundance. It becomes scarce, precious, and often unappetizing in ways that would shock anyone accustomed to year-round variety. Your stores, if you have them, consist of what could be preserved through autumn's preparation. Corn dried until the kernels rattle like stones, meat cut thin and dried until it resembles leather, berries pressed into compact cakes and stored in containers made from animal organs. But stores run low, and winter hunting presents challenges that go far beyond the simple scarcity of game. Animals have their own strategies for survival. Deer have moved to lower elevations or deeper into forest cover. Small game has gone underground or into hibernation. The birds that remained have grown wary and difficult to approach. Hunting in deep snow means moving slowly, laboriously, through terrain that fights every step. Your snowshoes, woven from sinew and wood with the skill of generations, help, but they don't make the journey easy. Each step sinks, each movement forward requires conscious effort. The snow gets into everything, inside your clothing, packed around your feet, clinging to your hair and eyebrows. And when you do find tracks, when you do locate game, the challenge has only begun. Your bow, crafted with care and precision, becomes unreliable in extreme cold. The sinew string may snap, the wooden shaft may become brittle. Your own hands, stiff and numb, struggle to draw the string with the smooth precision that successful hunting requires. More often than not, you return empty-handed, having expended precious energy for no reward except the knowledge that you tried. These failures accumulate, creating a mathematics of survival that grows more desperate with each passing day. Darkness comes early in winter, and with it, the longest part of each day's survival. These aren't nights filled with entertainment, with books or music or warm conversations around abundant fires. These are nights of endurance, of making your body as small as possible to conserve whatever warmth you've managed to create. Your family gathers together, but not for comfort in the way we might imagine it. You gather for survival, bodies pressed close, sharing warmth like a precious resource that must be carefully distributed. Children sleep between adults, their small bodies both contributing to and receiving from the collective heat. The conversations, when they happen, are quiet and practical. Who will take the first watch to tend the fire if there is one? How much food can be rationed for tomorrow? Should someone attempt to hunt despite the weather, or is it wiser to conserve energy and hope for better conditions? Sometimes there are no conversations at all. Sometimes the cold demands such complete focus on simply breathing, simply enduring from one moment to the next, that speech becomes an unnecessary luxury. Sleep comes in fragments, not the deep, restorative sleep of comfort, but a lighter dozing that keeps part of your consciousness alert to changes in temperature, to sounds that might indicate danger or opportunity, to the subtle shifts in your body's condition that could signal the beginning of something serious: frostbite, hypothermia, the slow surrender that winter sometimes claims. You wake repeatedly throughout the night, sometimes because the cold has found a new way through your defenses, sometimes because your body's position has cut off circulation and you must shift carefully without disturbing the delicate architecture of shared warmth that surrounds you. Sometimes because dreams of summer warmth have given way to the reality of winter darkness, and the contrast is too sharp to ignore. Days blur into one another, marked not by clocks or calendars, but by the subtle changes in light, in weather, in your body's growing adaptation to sustained hardship. Your world shrinks to immediate concerns, staying warm enough to think clearly, finding enough food to maintain strength, preserving enough energy to face another day of the same challenges. You learn to move differently, not with the casual confidence of easy seasons, but with the deliberate care of someone who understands that a twisted ankle, a soaked moccasin, a torn hide garment could escalate into life-threatening problems. Every action is considered, every movement calculated against its cost in precious energy. Your body begins to change, muscle tissue converted to fuel by a metabolism working overtime to maintain core temperature, hands and feet that lose sensation more quickly each day, a constant, gnawing hunger that colors every thought, every decision, every moment of waking consciousness. But perhaps more challenging than physical hardship is the psychological weight of uncertainty. You don't know how long this will last. You don't have weather forecasts or seasonal calendars to tell you that spring will arrive on a specific date. You only have hope, tradition, and the stories passed down by elders who survived their own terrible winters. Some days, hope feels substantial. The sun appears briefly, creating diamonds on the snow surface and reminding you that warmth still exists in the world. Other days, hope feels like a luxury you can't afford, and survival becomes simply the mechanical process of doing whatever it takes to reach the next moment, then the next, then the next, after that. This is the rhythm of winter survival, not the dramatic struggle against a single catastrophic event, but the quiet, persistent endurance of conditions that test every aspect of human resilience. Day after day, night after night, breath after careful breath. You are not heroic in this struggle, you are simply human, applying every skill, every piece of knowledge, every reserve of willpower to the single task of remaining alive in a world that feels increasingly indifferent to your existence. And yet somehow, morning continues to come. Somehow, you continue to wake. Somehow, despite odds that would discourage anyone with the luxury of choice, you persist. The cold has taught you things about yourself that easier times never could. You've learned the precise difference between discomfort and danger. You've discovered reserves of patience you didn't know existed. You've found ways to kindle not just fire, but hope, even when both seem impossible to sustain. This is what it meant to survive winter without the technologies we take for granted today. This is the daily reality that shaped entire civilizations, that created cultures of resilience, that forged people capable of thriving in conditions that would humble our modern understanding of hardship. Winter was not just a season to endure, it was a teacher, harsh but honest, that revealed the true depths of human capability when survival demands everything you have to give. As the first pale light of another winter morning filters through the smoke hole above, let us drift from your struggle to another's. A woman whose name whispers down through oral traditions like wind through dried corn stalks. Otsenega. The name means she who prepares. And in the winter of 1447, in a longhouse settlement near what we now call Lake Ontario, that name would prove prophetic in ways no one could have foreseen. She wakes as you did, with the sharp awareness that comes from sleeping in cold that never fully retreats. But her awakening carries different weights, different responsibilities. Around her, arranged along the sleeping platforms that line the longhouse walls, lie not just her own children, but the extended family group that depends on her particular gift, the ability to measure winter against preparation, to balance present need against future uncertainty. The longhouse stretches nearly 60 feet in length, its bark-covered frame home to 4 related families. Designed for efficiency and warmth, it represents generations of architectural wisdom. But even the finest longhouse cannot create heat from nothing, cannot manufacture food from empty storage pits, cannot stretch supplies beyond their natural limits. Otsenega rises carefully, her movements practiced and quiet. At 42 winters, she has survived enough cold seasons to understand their rhythms, their demands, their occasional mercies. Her breath forms small clouds as she moves through the familiar darkness, checking first on her own children, then on the elders, then on the stores that will determine whether spring finds them weakened but alive or claims them as winter's price. This morning, like every morning for the past month, her first task is the careful mathematics of survival. How much corn remains in the storage pits beneath the longhouse floor? How much dried squash? How many portions of preserved meat hang in the smoke-scented darkness above the central hearths? She counts not in abstract numbers, but in days. This much food equals this many sunrises, this rate of consumption equals this much time before the stores run empty. And always, always the question that haunts every winter leader: how long until spring? Otsenega's position in her community didn't come from birth or marriage, but from a particular combination of memory, judgment, and mathematical intuition that her people had learned to trust. She could look at the harvest and know with uncanny accuracy how it should be distributed across the dark months ahead. In autumn, while others focused on the immediate work of gathering and processing, Otsenega thought in terms of February, hunger, March, desperation, the lean weeks when winter's grip tightens just before releasing into spring. She calculated not just for average winters, but for the harsh ones, the years when snow fell early and stayed late, when hunting failed and stored food became the difference between survival and tragedy. Her storage pits, dug deep into the earth beneath the longhouse and lined with bark baskets, represented more than food. They represented hope methodically organized, survival carefully planned, the transformation of autumn's abundance into winter's lifeline. But this winter, the winter that would become known in family stories as the long winter, tested even her careful preparation. It began with snow in what should have been late hunting season. Not the light snow that signals winter's approach, but the heavy, persistent snow that speaks of a season settling in to stay. The hunters, who should have been bringing in the final stores of meat, instead returned empty-handed day after day, forced back by weather that made tracking impossible and travel dangerous. Then came the cold, not gradually, as winters usually build their strength, but all at once, like a door slamming shut on autumn's warmth. The lake, which normally froze slowly from the edges inward, solidified in a matter of days. Trees cracked with sounds like thunder. The very air seemed to crystallize, carrying ice particles that stung exposed skin. Otsenega adjusted her calculations. Where she had planned for a hard winter, she now planned for a catastrophic one. Rations that had seemed adequate were cut again, then cut again. Meals that had provided satisfaction became portions that merely sustained life. Managing hunger in a longhouse community required skills that went far beyond simple arithmetic. It required understanding the complex web of relationships, obligations, and hierarchies that determined not just who ate what, but when and in what order. The elders ate first, always. Not because they consumed the most, their aged bodies often needed less fuel than those still growing or working hard, but because their survival carried the community's memory, its stories, its accumulated wisdom about enduring exactly these kinds of trials. Children came next, but here Otsenega faced heartbreaking calculations. Growing bodies needed more food, but growing bodies were also more resilient, more likely to survive temporary deprivation? How much could she reduce a child's portion before causing permanent harm? How much could she preserve for the adults who needed strength to hunt, to gather firewood, to maintain the basic functions of group survival? The hunters received priority when they were active, extra rations that acknowledged the energy they expended trudging through snow in pursuit of game that grew more scarce each week. But when hunting proved futile day after day, when energy spent searching produced no return, their portions were reduced to match their contribution. Pregnant women, nursing mothers, the sick, the injured, each presented its own moral and practical equation. Save one, and you might doom another. Preserve the strong, and you might sacrifice the vulnerable. Protect the vulnerable, and you might weaken the strong beyond their ability to provide for anyone. Otsenega made these choices with the weight of lives in her hands, guided by traditions passed down through generations of winter survivors, but ultimately alone in the specific decisions that no tradition could anticipate. By the time the snow had lain unbroken for 6 weeks, even Otsenega's most pessimistic calculations proved optimistic. The stored corn, processed into every possible form, ground into meal, boiled into thin porridge, mixed with water and whatever game could be found, dwindled faster than anticipated. The squash, dried and carefully preserved, provided sweetness and vitamins that kept scurvy at bay, but offered little in the way of lasting sustenance. The dried meat, stretched into broths so thin they barely colored the water, couldn't satisfy the deep hunger that gnawed at every member of the longhouse. It was during this time that Otsenega's true gift revealed itself, not just the ability to manage abundance, but the creativity to find sustenance where others saw only emptiness. She taught the younger women to scrape the inner bark from basswood trees, processing it into a flour that could extend the corn supplies. She showed them how to dig through snow to find rose hips still clinging to winter branches, how to locate cached nuts that squirrels had buried and forgotten. More challenging still, she made the social adjustments that kept the community functioning despite growing desperation. When disputes arose over food distribution, her quiet authority settled them. When individuals hoarded private supplies, her gentle but firm interventions ensured that resources remained communal. When despair threatened to undermine the collective will to survive, her steady presence reminded everyone that spring had always returned before, would return again. But perhaps her most difficult innovation was the invention of feast days during the worst of the famine. Once each week, she would gather the entire longhouse community for what she called a celebration of endurance. The food was no more abundant than any other day, but it was presented differently, shared differently, experienced differently. Instead of individuals consuming their meager rations in isolated hunger, the community gathered in a circle. Stories were told, songs were sung softly, and the small amounts of food were distributed with ceremony and gratitude. These meals didn't provide more calories, but they provided something equally necessary, the sense that they were surviving together, that their individual struggles were part of a shared endeavor with meaning beyond mere existence. Leadership during abundance is one thing. Leadership during scarcity reveals different qualities entirely. As the long winter deepened, Otsenega found herself making decisions that would have been unthinkable in easier times. When the elderly grandmother Kanyenki began showing signs of what we might now recognize as severe malnutrition, Otsenega quietly increased her rations by reducing her own. When young Tekakwitha developed a persistent cough that threatened to become something more serious, Otsenega organized a rotation system that ensured the girl always slept in the warmest part of the longhouse, surrounded by the strongest bodies. But when Rawenio, a hunter whose pride had been wounded by weeks of unsuccessful expeditions, began hoarding portions of his rations while claiming they were insufficient, Otsenega faced a different kind of challenge. Confronting him directly, might fracture the social cohesion that held the group together. Ignoring his behavior might encourage others to follow his example. Her solution demonstrated the subtle intelligence that made her an effective leader. She began a new practice of having individuals share stories about their most successful hunts while the evening meal was distributed. Night after night, she encouraged tales of abundance, of skill rewarded, of contributions to community welfare. Rowennio, finding himself surrounded by stories that celebrated not just success but generosity, gradually began contributing his own narratives. And in telling these stories of his better days, he remembered the person he had been when times were easier. His hoarding stopped without direct confrontation, his pride redirected from defensive selfishness toward protective care for the community that valued his skills, even when those skills couldn't overcome impossible conditions. By midwinter, Otsenega's calculations had moved beyond food supplies to more abstract but equally crucial resources. How much hope remained in the community? How long could people endure increasing hardship without losing the will to continue? What was the balance between honest acknowledgement of their situation and the optimism necessary for survival? She began to understand that her role extended beyond managing physical resources to managing emotional and spiritual ones as well. The stories told during evening meals became more carefully chosen, narratives of past survival, of winters that had seemed endless but eventually yielded to spring, of ancestors who had faced similar trials and emerged with deeper wisdom. She rationed despair as carefully as she rationed food. When individuals showed signs of giving up, she found tasks that made them feel useful, contributions that reminded them of their value to the group. When the group's morale flagged, she shared small pieces of good news. A day when the wind calmed, tracks spotted near the longhouse, signs that suggested game might be returning to the area. But she also rationed false optimism. She never promised that rescue was imminent, never suggested that their situation was better than it actually was. Instead, she offered something more sustainable, the quiet confidence that they possessed, the skills, the knowledge, and the collective strength to endure whatever winter demanded of them. As winter's grip slowly, almost imperceptibly began to loosen, Otsenega faced perhaps her most difficult period. The stores were nearly exhausted. The community had survived on determination and ingenuity for weeks. Bodies had grown thin, energy reserves depleted. This was the time when winter claimed its victims, not in the dramatic early storms, but in the slow attrition of late season, when survival required resources that had been consumed months earlier. Yet this was also the time when her careful management began to pay dividends that went beyond simple calorie counting. The community that emerged from the longhouse each morning was weakened but intact. Relationships had been strained but not broken. The social fabric that held them together had been tested but not torn. Children, who had learned to find satisfaction in smaller portions, had also learned lessons about resilience that would serve them for the rest of their lives. Adults who had discovered reserves of patience they never knew they possessed had grown in ways that abundance never could have taught them. When the first crows returned, when the first ice began to crack along the lake's edge, when the first tiny buds appeared on maple branches, the community that witnessed these signs was not the same one that had entered winter months earlier. They had been transformed by hardship, refined by scarcity, welded together by shared endurance. Otsenega's leadership had helped them survive not just physically, but as a coherent group with bonds strengthened rather than weakened by their ordeal. Spring's arrival, when it finally came, felt both sudden and gradual. Sudden because after months of sameness, change seemed to happen all at once. Running water, returning birds, the first green shoots pushing through softening earth. Gradual because bodies weakened by winter couldn't immediately embrace abundance, couldn't suddenly transform from conservation mode to celebration. Otsenega's final challenge as winter's manager was overseeing the transition back to plenty. Stomachs that had shrunk couldn't handle large meals. Bodies adapted to scarcity needed time to readjust to adequate nutrition. The psychological habits of conservation had to give way gradually to the mindset of renewal. But, perhaps more importantly, she had to help the community understand what they had accomplished. They had not merely survived, they had demonstrated something profound about human capacity for adaptation, cooperation, and mutual care under conditions that tested every assumption about what people could endure. The stories that would be told about the long winter in years to come wouldn't focus on the misery or the deprivation. They would celebrate the ingenuity that found food where none seemed to exist, the cooperation that shared scarce resources fairly, the leadership that guided them through darkness without losing hope. Otsenega herself would be remembered not as a heroic figure who performed miraculous feats, but as someone who understood the deep mathematics of survival, not just the arithmetic of calories and days, but the more complex calculations that balance individual need against collective welfare, present comfort against future security, honest assessment against necessary optimism. She had learned and taught by example that survival was not just about having enough resources, but about using whatever resources existed with wisdom, efficiency, and grace. That leadership during crisis meant not just making hard decisions, but making them in ways that preserved the community's capacity to remain human even under inhuman conditions. As spring strengthened and the memories of winter's worst moments began to soften, Otsenega could look around her longhouse at faces that had grown thin but not bitter, at relationships that had been tested but not broken, at a community that had discovered reserves of strength they never knew they possessed. Winter had ended, as it always did, but they had not simply waited for it to pass. They had met it with intelligence, cooperation, and quiet courage. They had faced the worst that their world could offer and found ways not just to survive, but to remain fully human in the process. In the gentle warmth of late spring, as abundance slowly returned and the harsh memories began to fade, Otsenega understood that they had accomplished something that went beyond mere survival. They had proven to themselves and to the generations who would hear their stories that human beings, working together with wisdom and care, could endure almost anything. The long winter was over, but its lessons would endure as long as people remembered the quiet strength of a woman who knew how to count not just days and rations, but hope itself, measuring it out in careful portions that lasted exactly as long as they needed to last. As we drift away from Otsenega's longhouse, away from the intimate details of one woman's struggle against the long winter, let us step into a different kind of cold, the cool shadows of uncertainty that shroud so much of what we think we know about winter survival in pre-contact North America. Picture, if you will, an archaeologist working in the soft light of early morning, carefully brushing dirt from artifacts that have waited centuries to tell their stories. The tools emerge clearly: stone scrapers, bone needles, pottery shards that speak of daily life with remarkable clarity. Each artifact represents a moment in time, a human hand that shaped stone or carved bone with specific purpose. The summer camps reveal themselves through fire-cracked rock and fishbone deposits. Autumn sites display grinding stones, still stained with acorn meal, storage pits that once held winter provisions, the careful organization of seasonal abundance. But when winter comes into focus, when researchers seek evidence of how people survived the brutal months we've been exploring, the archaeological record becomes mysteriously quiet. The sites grow sparse, the artifact assemblages thin, the clear narrative threads that weave together other seasons dissolve into frustrating gaps and uncertainties. Why is this? Why can we reconstruct summer fishing techniques with precision understanding exactly how weirs were constructed and nets were weighted, trace autumn harvest patterns through preserved seeds and processing tools that reveal sophisticated scheduling and resource management, but find ourselves grasping at shadows when we try to understand the specific technologies that allowed people to thrive through winters that would defeat us today. The answer lies partly in the nature of winter survival itself. The techniques that worked best were often the most ephemeral, designed to use materials that would biodegrade completely, structures that would melt away with spring's return, knowledge that lived in hands and hearts rather than in objects that could survive centuries in the ground. The very effectiveness of these solutions lay in their integration with natural processes, their ability to work with rather than against the forces that threatened survival. Snow leaves no archaeological trace beyond the brief impressions that vanish with the next warming. Breath leaves no fossil record, though it was perhaps the most critical resource of all. The warm exhalation that created microclimates within shelters, the careful control of breathing that prevented hypothermia, the shared breath that kept infants alive through the coldest nights. The patient wisdom of endurance creates no artifacts for future generations to study and admire, leaving behind only the ultimate proof of its effectiveness: survival itself. Consider the shelters that protected our ancestors through months of killing cold. We know they existed. Survival itself proves their effectiveness beyond any doubt. Thousands of people lived through thousands of winters, generation after generation, in climates that regularly reached temperatures we would consider lethal. The mathematics of survival demand that these shelters were not just adequate, but sophisticated architectural solutions that solved complex problems of insulation, ventilation, structural integrity, and resource efficiency. But what exactly did they look like? How were they constructed? What innovations allowed them to retain heat while remaining portable enough for communities that might need to move when game grew scarce or fuel supplies dwindled? What engineering principles governed their design? How were they adapted for different terrain, varying group sizes, changing weather conditions? The few descriptions that survive in early ethnographic accounts hint at architectural solutions so elegant they seem almost magical. Structures built from snow itself, engineered to create insulation from the very element that threatened to kill. The physics of this achievement staggers the imagination, using ice crystals to create thermal barriers, understanding how different snow consistencies behaved under load, knowing exactly how to shape entrances to create airlocks while maintaining structural integrity. Shelters that used the thermal properties of Earth, digging into hillsides to find the planet's stored warmth. These weren't simple holes in the ground, but carefully engineered excavations that balanced insulation against drainage, that understood soil composition and groundwater patterns, that could predict how different Earth types would behave during freeze-thaw cycles. The knowledge required to site these shelters correctly, to orient them for optimal solar gain while protecting them from prevailing winds, represents a sophisticated understanding of microclimate that modern architects struggle to achieve with advanced instruments. Lean-tos that captured and redirected wind rather than simply opposing it. These structures worked with fluid dynamics in ways that suggest deep understanding of how air moves across different surfaces, how to create pressure differentials that pulled smoke away from living spaces while drawing warm air inward. The angles weren't arbitrary, they represented precise calculations about wind patterns, thermal dynamics, the behavior of heated air masses under varying atmospheric conditions. But these accounts were written by outsiders, often decades or centuries after the techniques they describe had been abandoned or modified through contact with European technologies. The descriptions carry the peculiar distortion that comes when one culture tries to explain another's innovations through its own conceptual framework. European observers brought assumptions about construction, about the relationship between shelter and security, about the very nature of human habitation that colored everything they recorded. Moreover, these outside observers typically encountered winter shelters during brief visits, often in modified forms already influenced by trade goods and changing circumstances. They rarely witnessed the full seasonal cycle of construction, use, and abandonment that would have revealed the complete sophistication of these systems. Their accounts focus on obvious features while missing subtle innovations that made the difference between life and death. What we're left with are tantalizing glimpses of knowledge systems so sophisticated they could keep people alive through conditions that modern survival experts would consider lethal. Expert mountaineers today, equipped with space-age materials and emergency communication devices, sometimes perish in conditions that were routine winter weather for countless generations of Native Americans. The gap between their survival capacity and our own, despite all our technological advantages, suggests knowledge systems of staggering sophistication. Yet the specific details, the precise angles that optimized heat retention, the material combinations that provided maximum insulation with minimum weight, the engineering principles that governed structural decisions, remain elusive, lost in the gap between what worked and what could be preserved in archaeological deposits. The knowledge was clearly there, proven by its results, but transmitted through methods so different from our own record-keeping systems that we struggle to even recognize its complexity. Imagine snow shelters that were somehow both insulated and ventilated, providing protection from wind while allowing the dangerous carbon monoxide from heating fires to escape. The engineering challenge this represents is remarkable, creating structures that sealed against cold while maintaining safe air circulation that could be quickly constructed in emergency conditions while incorporating sophisticated ventilation systems that prevented both suffocation and heat loss. Think about the mathematical precision required to calculate exactly how thick ice walls needed to be to provide structural integrity without conducting fatal amounts of cold inward. This wasn't guesswork. People's lives depended on getting these calculations exactly right. The knowledge had to account for different types of ice, varying atmospheric conditions, the thermal properties of different insulating materials, the heat output of different fuel sources. These weren't random improvisations born of desperation. They were refined technologies perfected over generations of trial and error, passed down through hands-on teaching that left no written records, no blueprint, no instruction manual for future archaeologists to discover. Each generation inherited techniques that had been tested under the ultimate selective pressure, literal life and death, and had been proven effective enough to ensure survival under the most challenging conditions North America could provide. The sophistication becomes even more apparent when we consider the variations that must have existed. Different regions faced different challenges. Coastal areas dealt with maritime weather patterns and salt air corrosion. Mountain regions required solutions for altitude and extreme temperature variation. Prairie communities needed portability and wind resistance. Forest dwellers could utilize abundant timber but faced different fuel management challenges. Each region, each community, probably each extended family group, developed specialized adaptations of these basic technologies, fine-tuned for their specific environmental niche. The knowledge systems weren't just sophisticated, they were remarkably flexible, capable of rapid adaptation as conditions changed, as communities moved, as resource availability shifted. Perhaps even more mysterious than shelter construction were the techniques used for personal insulation. We know from surviving examples that Native Americans created remarkably sophisticated clothing systems, layered, fitted, adapted to specific climatic conditions and activity requirements, but the archaeological record only preserves fragments, partial glimpses of what must have been comprehensive technologies for maintaining body heat under extreme conditions. The principles involved were clearly advanced. Modern outdoor equipment manufacturers spend millions of dollars researching insulation systems that Native Americans developed using nothing but careful observation and experimentation. Today's best cold weather clothing incorporates layering systems, moisture management, wind resistance, and thermal regulation principles that native communities had mastered centuries before the scientific revolution. Consider the materials mentioned in historical accounts: cattail down, milkweed silk, the soft underfur of various animals, processed plant fibers that could trap air while remaining lightweight and flexible. These organic insulators would have been revolutionary in their effectiveness, creating dead air spaces that prevented heat loss while allowing moisture transfer that prevented dangerous accumulation of sweat and condensation. Cattail down, for instance, possesses insulation properties that rival modern synthetic fills, but with advantages no manufactured material has achieved. It's completely biodegradable, locally sourced, renewable, and requires no industrial processing. Yet harvesting, preparing, and incorporating cattail down into clothing systems required knowledge of seasonal timing, processing techniques, storage methods, and construction skills that modern textile experts are only beginning to understand. These organic insulators would have been revolutionary in their effectiveness, yet they decompose completely, leaving no trace for modern researchers to analyze. We can examine surviving garments made from more durable materials, but the most sophisticated insulation systems, those that made the difference between survival and death in extreme cold, vanish without a trace, taking their secrets with them. There are suggestions in oral traditions of clothing that was almost weightless, yet kept people warm in temperatures that would require heavy down parkas today. These accounts describe garments so precisely fitted and efficiently designed that they provided maximum insulation with minimal bulk, allowing the freedom of movement necessary for hunting, travel, and daily activities even under extreme conditions. Descriptions of footwear that could be worn through snow for hours without the wearer's feet becoming cold or wet reveal understanding of thermal dynamics, moisture management, and biomechanics that modern boot manufacturers struggled to achieve. These weren't simple moccasins, but sophisticated systems that probably incorporated multiple layers, specialized insulation materials, and innovative design features that protected against both heat loss and moisture penetration. References to headgear that protected against wind while somehow maintaining peripheral vision and hearing acuity necessary for hunting suggest solutions to complex design challenges. How do you create protection against freezing winds while preserving the sensory awareness that hunting requires? How do you prevent frost formation that would block vision while maintaining thermal protection for the most heat-sensitive parts of the human body? But how exactly were these materials processed? What techniques transformed raw plant and animal matter into insulation systems that rival anything modern technology has produced? The knowledge was clearly there. Survival through countless harsh winters proves its effectiveness beyond question, but the specific processes remain locked away in the past, accessible only through scattered clues and educated speculation. The processing of organic insulation materials alone would have represented a significant body of specialized knowledge. Understanding which plants to harvest at what times, how to prepare fibers for maximum loft and durability, how to clean and process animal furs to retain their insulating properties while making them workable for garment construction. Each step in these processes probably involved techniques refined over generations, specific methods for removing oils without damaging fiber structure, ways of drying materials that preserved their insulating properties, storage techniques that prevented deterioration while maintaining accessibility for use. The knowledge would have been passed down through apprenticeship systems that ensured quality control while allowing for innovation and improvement. Some native communities maintained these techniques well into the historical period, but European contact often disrupted the transmission of traditional knowledge. Trade goods, wool blankets, metal tools, manufactured clothing provided alternatives that were sometimes more convenient but often less precisely adapted to specific environmental challenges. The disruption wasn't simply a matter of new materials replacing old ones. European trade goods came with different maintenance requirements, different performance characteristics, different relationships to environmental conditions. A wool blanket might be easier to obtain than the materials for traditional clothing systems, but it didn't provide the same precise thermal regulation, the same moisture management, the same integration with other survival technologies. Moreover, the trade goods often required different supporting knowledge systems. Traditional clothing was part of integrated survival strategies that included specific hunting techniques, resource management practices, seasonal scheduling patterns. When the clothing systems changed, the entire integrated approach to winter survival often had to be modified or abandoned. By the time ethnographers began systematically documenting traditional technologies, many of the most sophisticated winter survival techniques had already been modified or abandoned. What survived were often simplified versions, adapted to new materials and changing circumstances, carrying only echoes of the original innovations. The ethnographic record thus presents us with a paradox: detailed descriptions of techniques that were clearly effective, but descriptions that may not represent the full sophistication of the original systems. We're seeing winter survival technologies through the lens of cultural disruption, observing systems that were already adapting to new circumstances, new materials, new challenges. This means that even our best historical sources may not capture the full sophistication of pre-contact winter survival knowledge. The techniques that were documented were those that could be adapted to new circumstances, that could be explained to outside observers, that could survive cultural disruption. The most specialized, the most precisely calibrated, the most environmentally integrated techniques may have disappeared before anyone thought to record them. Perhaps most mysterious of all are the hints that winter survival involved not just physical technologies, but elaborate spiritual and psychological systems designed to maintain mental health and social cohesion during months of extreme stress. The challenge of surviving winter wasn't just physical, it was profoundly psychological, requiring techniques for managing isolation, depression, interpersonal conflict, and the various forms of mental breakdown that extreme conditions could trigger. References appear in scattered accounts to midwinter ceremonies that weren't simply religious observances but sophisticated psychological technologies for managing the despair, cabin fever, and social tension that could destroy communities from within. These rituals somehow transformed the experience of scarcity from individual suffering into collective meaning, creating shared purpose and mutual support during the most challenging times. Think about the challenge this represents. How do you design cultural practices that help people not just survive physical hardship, but maintain their humanity, their relationships, their capacity for joy and hope, even under conditions of extreme deprivation? How do you create social mechanisms that prevent the psychological deterioration that could be as deadly as cold or hunger? The ceremonies that are documented suggest systems of remarkable psychological sophistication, storytelling traditions that provided entertainment while also transmitting survival knowledge, weaving together information about weather patterns, resource management, and survival techniques with narratives that made the knowledge memorable and emotionally engaging. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were sophisticated information storage and transmission systems. In cultures without written records, stories served as databases, encoding complex technical knowledge in forms that could be accurately transmitted across generations. The storytelling traditions associated with winter survival probably contain detailed technical information about weather prediction, resource management, and survival techniques, embedded in narratives that made the information both memorable and emotionally meaningful. Dance and music that maintained physical conditioning while building community bonds represent another level of sophisticated social technology. Winter survival required not just individual resilience, but community cohesion. People confined together for months under stressful conditions needed structured ways to maintain social relationships, to work through conflicts before they became destructive, to preserve the cooperative relationships that survival required. The physical aspects of these practices were probably carefully designed as well. Dance and music that kept people active during months of relative inactivity, that maintained cardiovascular conditioning and muscle tone, that prevented the physical deterioration that could compromise survival capacity. The activities weren't just social, they were integrated fitness programs designed to maintain survival-relevant physical capabilities, rituals of sharing that reinforced social cooperation while managing individual selfishness address one of the fundamental challenges of survival under scarcity. How do you maintain cooperative behavior when resources are limited and individual survival instincts might lead to hoarding or conflict? How do you design social systems that reward cooperation while discouraging free riding? But these accounts often focus on the observable external elements, the songs, the movements, the objects used, while the deeper psychological mechanisms remain opaque. How exactly did these practices work? What understanding of human nature informed their development? How were they calibrated to address the specific mental health challenges of prolonged winter isolation? Modern psychology recognizes that isolation, confinement, and resource scarcity can trigger various forms of mental illness, depression, anxiety, interpersonal conflict, loss of motivation, and, in extreme cases, complete psychological breakdown. Native communities facing these same challenges developed cultural practices that somehow prevented or mitigated these psychological dangers. Some traditions hinted even more sophisticated approaches, techniques for managing group dynamics when people were confined together for months, methods for maintaining leadership structures when survival stress tested every social bond, practices for integrating individual spiritual experience with collective welfare. The leadership challenges alone would have required remarkable sophistication. How do you maintain authority and decision-making capacity under conditions that stress everyone beyond normal limits? How do you make decisions about resource allocation when any mistake could be fatal? How do you handle conflicts between individuals when the survival of the entire group depends on cooperation? These weren't primitive superstitions, but refined technologies for psychological survival, developed through generations of careful observation and experimentation. The practices were tested under conditions of extreme stress, refined through trial and error, validated by their success in maintaining community cohesion under the most challenging conditions. Yet because they dealt with internal states rather than external objects, they left almost no archaeological trace, no physical evidence for modern researchers to study and understand. We can sometimes identify the locations where ceremonies took place, occasionally find artifacts associated with ritual activities, but the psychological technologies themselves, the specific mechanisms that maintained mental health and social cohesion, remain largely invisible to archaeological investigation. The more we examine what we don't know about native winter survival, the more apparent it becomes that we're looking at the remnants of entire knowledge systems, sophisticated sciences developed over millennia and then largely lost through the disruptions of colonization and cultural change. These weren't just collections of survival tips, but integrated approaches to human adaptation that addressed physical, psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions of survival under extreme conditions. Consider the meteorological knowledge that would have been necessary for reliable winter survival. Not just the ability to observe weather patterns, but to understand them at a level that enabled accurate long-term prediction. Knowing not just that winter was coming, but how severe it would be, how long it would last, what specific challenges it would present, when it would end. This knowledge had to be precise enough to guide critical decisions: how much food to store, when to move to winter camps, how to allocate resources among different survival strategies, when to begin preparation for spring activities. Mistakes in these calculations weren't just inconvenient, they were potentially fatal for entire communities. The knowledge systems that guided these decisions had to be extraordinarily accurate, based on careful observation of environmental indicators that modern meteorology is only beginning to understand. Native weather prediction probably incorporated astronomical observations, animal behavior patterns, plant phenology, atmospheric indicators, and dozens of other environmental variables that provided information about long-term weather trends. Yet what we know of native meteorological knowledge comes mostly from fragmentary accounts, often filtered through the misunderstanding of observers who didn't recognize the sophistication of what they were witnessing. References to weather prediction based on animal behavior, plant growth patterns, astronomical observations, but rarely with enough detail to understand the underlying principles or the integration of multiple information sources. Modern meteorology, despite all its technological advantages, still struggles with long-term weather prediction. The fact that native communities regularly made accurate seasonal predictions with nothing but careful observation suggests knowledge systems of remarkable sophistication. They understood environmental patterns that we're only beginning to recognize, integrating information from multiple sources in ways that provided reliable predictions about conditions months in the future. Similarly, the ecological knowledge required for winter survival must have been phenomenally sophisticated. Understanding which plants retained nutritional value through freezing, how to locate and process emergency food sources under snow cover, how to predict where game would move as conditions changed throughout the winter season. This ecological knowledge probably extended far beyond simple resource identification. Understanding seasonal variations in nutritional content, knowing how different processing techniques affected food value and storage life, predicting how animal behavior would change under different weather conditions, understanding the complex relationships between weather patterns, plant growth, animal movements, and resource availability. Knowledge of how different materials behaved under extreme cold was essential for tool maintenance and modification. Metal became brittle, wood changed its working properties, stone might fracture differently, organic materials had to be protected against freezing damage. The knowledge required to maintain essential tools and equipment throughout winter represented another specialized body of technical understanding. The ability to manage fire and fuel with maximum efficiency was literally a matter of life and death. Understanding which woods burned hottest, which provided the longest-lasting coals, how to build fires that maximized heat while minimizing fuel consumption, how to manage combustion for different purposes, cooking, heating, tool manufacture, light production. These weren't collections of random survival tips, but integrated systems of knowledge that allowed people to thrive in environments that would challenge our most advanced technologies. Yet because this knowledge was transmitted orally, embedded in daily practice, and constantly adapted to local conditions, it left few traces that modern researchers can reconstruct with confidence. The oral transmission systems themselves probably represented sophisticated technologies for preserving and transmitting complex technical information. How do you ensure that critical survival knowledge is accurately passed from generation to generation without written records? How do you build in redundancy and error checking? How do you adapt knowledge to new conditions while preserving essential core information? Native communities developed elaborate systems for knowledge transmission that modern education is only beginning to understand. Apprenticeship programs that ensured hands-on learning, storytelling traditions that encoded technical information in memorable forms, ceremonial practices that reinforced important knowledge, social structures that rewarded expertise and ensured that critical knowledge was preserved and transmitted. This brings us to one of the most intriguing mysteries surrounding native winter survival, the question of human biological adaptation. Did generations of surviving extreme cold create actual physical changes that enhanced survival capacity? And if so, how quickly were these adaptations lost when traditional lifestyles changed? There are hints in historical accounts of physical characteristics that seem almost too good to be coincidental. References to people who seemed remarkably resistant to cold, who could function effectively in conditions that incapacitated European observers, who showed few signs of distress during temperature extremes that would be considered dangerous today. early contact accounts frequently mention Native Americans wearing what Europeans considered inadequate clothing in conditions that required heavy winter gear. Descriptions of people traveling long distances through snow with minimal protection, working outdoors in conditions that forced Europeans to seek shelter, maintaining normal activities during weather that Europeans found debilitating. Were these purely cultural adaptations, the result of conditioning, training, and psychological preparation? Or were there biological components as well? Did isolated populations develop enhanced circulation patterns that prevented frostbite and hypothermia? Modified metabolic responses that maintained body temperature more efficiently, improved cold tolerance at the cellular level? The questions become even more intriguing when we consider the speed with which these apparent adaptations seem to disappear. Accounts from the early contact period often describe dramatic differences in cold tolerance between native populations and Europeans. But these differences appear to have diminished relatively quickly as traditional lifestyles changed. This suggests that whatever adaptations existed were highly dependent on specific cultural practices, dietary patterns that provided optimal nutrition for cold adaptation, physical conditioning routines that maintained circulation and metabolic efficiency, psychological preparation techniques that enabled effective response to cold stress. The dietary components alone probably represented sophisticated nutritional knowledge. Understanding which foods provided the metabolic support necessary for cold adaptation, how to combine different nutrients for maximum effectiveness, when and how to modify diet in preparation for winter conditions. Traditional diets probably incorporated foods that modern nutrition is only beginning to understand, plant medicines that supported circulation, animal fats that provided optimal insulation and metabolic support, mineral sources that supported cellular function under cold stress. The knowledge required to identify, process, and combine these nutritional elements represents another dimension of winter survival sophistication. Physical conditioning practices were probably equally sophisticated, designed to maintain the cardiovascular fitness, muscle tone, and metabolic efficiency necessary for cold adaptation. Activities that look like games or ceremonies probably served important conditioning functions, maintaining survival-relevant fitness throughout the year. But what exactly were these practices? How did they work? What specific techniques enabled such remarkable cold adaptation, and why were they so difficult to maintain once traditional cultural systems were disrupted? The integration of all these elements, physical conditioning, nutritional support, psychological preparation, social cooperation, probably created synergistic effects that were greater than the sum of their parts. People weren't just adapted to cold in one dimension, but in multiple interconnected ways that reinforced each other and created remarkable resilience. When traditional lifestyles were disrupted, the entire integrated system of adaptation was compromised. It wasn't just a matter of losing individual techniques, but of losing the integrated approach that made those techniques effective. New materials and new social conditions required different approaches, but the knowledge for developing new integrated systems had to be rebuilt from scratch. As we drift deeper into these questions, it becomes clear that we're confronting something profound about the nature of human knowledge itself. Here were techniques and understanding systems sophisticated enough to enable survival under conditions that would defeat modern technology, yet they were transmitted and maintained through methods so different from our own knowledge systems that we struggle to even recognize their complexity. The knowledge wasn't stored in books or databases, but in the integrated experience of communities that lived these techniques daily. It wasn't abstract information, but embodied knowledge that existed in the successful practice of survival. The sophistication lay not in theoretical understanding, but in the precise calibration of techniques to specific environmental conditions and human needs. Modern knowledge systems excel at storing and transmitting abstract information, but they often struggle with the kind of integrated, experience-based knowledge that traditional communities developed. We can document individual techniques, but we have difficulty understanding how they fit together into coherent systems. We can observe the results, but we struggle to reconstruct the underlying principles. The mysteries aren't just academic curiosities. In an era of climate change and environmental uncertainty, understanding how human communities develop such resilient, sustainable relationships with extreme environments becomes increasingly relevant. These weren't just primitive survival techniques, but sophisticated technologies for living within natural systems rather than attempting to dominate them. The sustainable aspects of traditional winter survival are particularly remarkable. These communities survived for thousands of years without depleting their resource base, without creating environmental damage that compromised future survival, without developing technologies that were ultimately self-destructive. They achieved what modern civilization struggles to accomplish: long-term sustainability in the face of environmental challenges. Yet the more we study the fragmentary evidence, the more mysterious these achievements become. We can document their effectiveness. Survival itself proves that these techniques worked. We can sometimes observe their remnants in traditional practices that survived into the historical period. But the specific mechanisms, the detailed knowledge that made such remarkable adaptation possible remains tantalizingly out of reach. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some knowledge is so embedded in direct experience, so dependent on intimate relationship with specific environments, that it can't be preserved in the abstract forms that our culture values. Perhaps the mystery itself reminds us of the limitations of trying to understand truly integrated knowledge systems through the fragmented methods of academic research. The people who developed these winter survival techniques didn't think of themselves as mysterious. They were simply doing what humans do, adapting to their environment through careful observation, creative problem-solving, and patient accumulation of knowledge across generations. The techniques weren't mysterious to them. They were practical solutions to immediate problems, refined through generations of use and improvement. The mystery exists for us because we're trying to reconstruct their achievements from scattered fragments, like archaeologists attempting to understand a complex machine from a few surviving gears. We're looking at the remnants of integrated systems through the lens of fragmented disciplines, trying to understand holistic knowledge through specialized academic methods. But even incomplete understanding carries lessons. The very fact that such sophisticated survival systems existed suggests possibilities for human adaptation that we may have forgotten. The mysteries remind us that our ancestors were not primitive people struggling with inadequate technologies, but innovators who developed solutions to survival challenges that remain unsurpassed today. The achievements suggest that human ingenuity, when combined with patience, careful observation, and deep respect for natural systems, can accomplish things that seem impossible until someone actually does them. The knowledge systems that enabled winter survival represent human intellectual achievement on par with any scientific discovery developed through methods that were no less rigorous for being different from our own. In the gentle darkness of winter night, when wind carries the memory of countless storms and snowfalls with the same patterns that challenged our ancestors, perhaps it's enough to know that the solutions existed, even if we can't fully grasp how they worked. Perhaps the mystery itself is part of the lesson, a reminder that human knowledge takes many forms, that wisdom can be embedded in practice as well as theory, that some of our most important achievements may leave no trace except their success. The archaeological silence speaks as eloquently as any artifact. In that silence we hear the echo of knowledge so sophisticated it transcended the need to leave physical traces, wisdom so complete it lived entirely in the successful practice of staying human under inhuman conditions. The silence reminds us that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that some of our species' greatest achievements may be invisible to the methods we use to study the past. Perhaps that's the deepest lesson of all. In our search for the secrets of winter survival, we discover not just the limitations of our knowledge, but the remarkable capacity of human beings to develop solutions to seemingly impossible challenges. The mystery isn't a frustration, it's an invitation to humility, a reminder that human ingenuity has taken forms we're only beginning to recognize, and a challenge to expand our understanding of what knowledge can be and how it can be preserved across the generations. As we drift away from the mysteries that time has buried, let us turn our attention to a different kind of winter experience, one that existed simultaneously with the struggles we've explored, yet seemed to belong to an entirely different world. Picture a longhouse, much like the one where Otsenega managed her community's survival, but larger, more elaborately constructed, positioned with careful attention to winter winds and water access. This is the winter residence of Haudenosaunee, a leader whose name would echo through Haudenosaunee traditions for generations to come. The very location of this longhouse reveals the advantages that privilege could secure. While ordinary families built their winter shelters wherever they could find suitable ground, Haudenosaunee residents occupied prime territory. A slight elevation that provided natural drainage, positioned to catch morning sunlight that would warm the structure through shortened winter days, yet sheltered by hills and mature forests that blocked the worst of the winter winds that could turn a comfortable dwelling into a frozen tomb. Inside, the contrast with common winter experience becomes immediately apparent. Where ordinary families huddled around single hearths, carefully rationing fuel with the precision of mathematicians calculating survival, this longhouse maintains multiple fires burning steadily through the night. Each fire pit is larger, deeper, lined with carefully selected stones that absorb heat during the day and radiate warmth through the dark hours when temperatures plummet toward levels that could kill the unprepared. The smoke holes above are larger, better engineered, allowing for more efficient heating without the dangerous carbon monoxide buildup that threatened smaller dwellings. These aren't simple openings cut through bark and thatch, but sophisticated ventilation systems designed by generations of accumulated knowledge. Clay-lined chimneys, adjustable covers that could be modified according to wind direction and weather intensity, systems for managing the delicate balance between maintaining warmth and preventing the invisible death that came from breathing poisoned air. The sleeping platforms are raised higher from the ground, built with more sophisticated carpentry that includes natural insulation systems, layers of bark, fur, and specially processed plant materials that create barriers against the cold that seeps up from frozen earth like a living thing seeking to claim human warmth. The walls themselves are thicker, constructed with double layers of bark and additional materials that provide insulation ordinary families couldn't afford to use, materials that required trade networks, specialized processing, and labor investments that went far beyond basic survival needs. But perhaps most significant is what lines those walls. Food stores that would seem impossible to anyone struggling through the kind of winter we've been exploring, baskets upon baskets of processed corn, beans, and squash. Not just the basic varieties that sustained life, but specialized cultivars that had been developed for their superior storage qualities, their enhanced nutritional content, their ability to maintain flavor and texture through months of preservation. These weren't accident crops saved from necessity, but carefully planned surplus created through agricultural techniques that required extensive knowledge, favorable growing conditions, and sufficient labor to manage crops beyond subsistence requirements. Preserved meat hanging in carefully organized rows, protected from moisture and pests by techniques that required both knowledge and resources. Fish smoked and stored in quantities that represented not just survival, but genuine abundance. Waterfowl prepared with complex preservation methods that maintained their nutritional value while creating flavors that could make even winter meals genuinely pleasurable rather than merely adequate for sustaining life. This wasn't the result of luck or accident. It was the product of systematic privilege, carefully maintained social structures that ensured certain individuals and families had access to resources that remained beyond the reach of ordinary community members. The abundance visible in elite winter quarters represented not just individual success, but the concentration of community resources in ways that created dramatic disparities in winter experience. The differences extended beyond simple quantity to sophisticated technologies for winter comfort that reveal remarkable engineering knowledge developed over generations of accumulated experience and transmitted through families who could afford to maintain specialized expertise. Tadodaho's longhouse incorporated heating systems that went far beyond basic fire maintenance. Underground passages, carefully constructed during autumn preparation when the earth was still workable, allowed cold air to be pre-warmed before entering the main living spaces. These weren't simple tunnels, but engineered systems that took advantage of the Earth's natural thermal properties, drawing air through underground channels where it absorbed warmth from the deeper soil layers that remained above freezing even when surface temperatures could kill exposed humans within hours. Heat from cooking fires was channeled through stone and clay systems that radiated warmth long after the flames died down. Thermal mass systems that stored heat energy during active cooking periods and released it gradually throughout the night, ensuring that sleeping areas remained comfortable even when fires were allowed to burn low to conserve fuel. These systems represented sophisticated understanding of thermal dynamics, knowledge that had to be accumulated through generations of experimentation and refinement. Sleeping areas were positioned to take advantage of natural thermal patterns, with the warmest spots reserved for the most important family members. But this wasn't arbitrary privilege. It reflected understanding of how heat moved through enclosed spaces, how body warmth could be most efficiently preserved, how the social hierarchy could be aligned with physical comfort in ways that served both individual welfare and community leadership needs. Even more sophisticated were the ventilation systems that allowed for substantial fires without the smoke and carbon monoxide problems that limited heating options for ordinary families. These weren't simple smoke holes, but engineered airways that created proper draft patterns, ensuring that heated air circulated efficiently while dangerous gases were expelled safely. The engineering required understanding of air pressure, wind patterns, and the complex physics of combustion that could mean the difference between comfortable warmth and deadly suffocation. The floors incorporated drainage systems that prevented the moisture problems that plagued simpler dwellings. Raised platforms and channels ensured that melting snow and condensation from breathing and cooking didn't create the damp conditions that could lead to hypothermia or respiratory illness. During winter, moisture control became as critical as temperature control. Dampness could kill as surely as cold, creating conditions where human bodies lost heat faster than they could generate it, where respiratory infections could develop into fatal illnesses without access to healing resources that winter often made unavailable. These weren't innovations that any individual could implement. They required coordinated labor, specialized knowledge, and access to materials that had to be gathered and processed months in advance. They represented collective investment in the comfort of specific individuals, community resources channeled toward ensuring that some people would experience winter very differently from others. The sophisticated comfort systems in elite households required community-wide resource allocation decisions that prioritized certain families' welfare over broader equality in winter experience. How did such disparity develop and persist in communities where survival often required cooperation and resource sharing? The answer lies in understanding winter not just as a season of hardship, but as a time when social hierarchies became both more necessary and more visible, when the theoretical equality that might characterize abundant seasons gave way to practical inequalities that could determine who lived and who died. During abundant seasons, leadership might be relatively egalitarian, with decisions made through consensus and resources distributed fairly broadly. Summer councils where every adult voice carried weight, autumn gatherings where community decisions emerged through extended discussion and negotiation. But winter created different dynamics, when survival depended on careful planning, resource allocation, and sometimes life or death decisions about rationing, communities often found it efficient to concentrate authority in individuals with proven judgment and experience. Tadodaho's privileges weren't simply inherited or arbitrarily assigned. They were in part payment for responsibilities that ordinary community members preferred not to bear. He was the one who had to decide which families received additional rations when children were sick, which households would be asked to contribute more to community welfare when resources ran shorter than anticipated, which individuals would be sent on dangerous winter hunting expeditions when stored food supplies proved inadequate. He mediated disputes over resource allocation when tensions ran high during the worst weeks of cold and scarcity, when families accused each other of hoarding, when individuals suspected their neighbors of consuming more than their fair share, when the social cooperation that enabled winter survival began to fray under the pressure of genuine hardship. These were the moments when concentrated authority became essential for community survival, when someone had to make decisions that affected others' lives without the luxury of extended consultation or consensus building. His longhouse served as a kind of community center during winter, a place where important decisions were made, disputes resolved, and plans developed for spring activities. The comfort and abundance maintained there weren't just personal luxuries, but investments in leadership capacity, ensuring that the people making critical decisions had the physical and mental resources necessary to make them well. Leaders who were weakened by inadequate nutrition or distracted by personal survival concerns couldn't provide the kind of clear thinking and decisive action that winter crises often demanded. But the system also created feedback loops that reinforced privilege across generations. Children who grew up in warm, well-fed households were more likely to develop the physical and intellectual capacities that made them effective leaders. Bodies that hadn't been stunted by childhood malnutrition, minds that hadn't been impaired by the stress and distraction of chronic hunger, personalities that had been shaped by security rather than scarcity. These advantages accumulated over lifetime and created leadership capabilities that seemed to justify continued privilege. Families with access to abundant resources could invest more time in education, skill development, and relationship building that enhanced their social position. While ordinary families focused their energy on immediate survival needs, elite households could dedicate labor and attention to long-term investments, developing expertise in weather prediction, resource management, diplomatic negotiation, and spiritual practices that made them increasingly indispensable to community welfare. Winter elite didn't just consume more resources, they used their privileged position to develop knowledge and skills that justified continued privilege. They became the keepers of complex information about weather patterns, resource management, and social coordination that made them increasingly indispensable to community survival. This knowledge wasn't simply inherited wisdom, but continuously developing expertise that required the leisure time and mental energy that only secure circumstances could provide. Perhaps nowhere was the contrast between elite and common winter experience more visible than in the practice of midwinter feasting. While ordinary families practiced careful rationing, counting out each day's portions with mathematical precision that could mean the difference between surviving until spring and perishing in the final weeks before abundance returned, elite households maintained the capacity for genuine abundance even during the harshest months. These weren't simply displays of excess, but sophisticated social technologies that served multiple functions. Midwinter feasts brought scattered community members together during the darkest months, providing social contact that helped prevent the isolation and despair that could be as deadly as cold or hunger. The psychological benefits of community gathering, of shared celebration during the most difficult time of year, of collective reassurance that survival was possible and spring would eventually return. These weren't luxuries, but essential elements of community resilience that required significant resource investment to maintain. For the elite, hosting such events demonstrated their capacity to manage resources effectively, their continued ability to provide for community welfare even under challenging conditions. But the demonstrations served practical as well as political purposes. Communities needed confidence in their leadership during winter months, when small mistakes in resource management or decision-making could have catastrophic consequences. Midwinter abundance provided tangible evidence that leaders possessed both the resources and the judgment necessary to guide the community through its most vulnerable season. For ordinary community members, the feasts provided not just rare abundance, but reassurance that survival was possible, that spring would come, that their sacrifices and hardships served larger purposes. The psychological impact of shared feast during the depths of winter scarcity couldn't be measured simply in calories consumed, but in hope maintained, social bonds reinforced, and collective commitment to mutual survival renewed during the season when individual desperation might otherwise fragment community cooperation. The preparation for these feasts revealed other dimensions of elite privilege. While common families focused their autumn efforts on basic survival preparation, elite households could allocate labor toward more sophisticated food processing, preservation techniques that created delicacies rather than simple sustenance. The difference wasn't just in quantity but in quality. Foods prepared in ways that maintained or enhanced nutritional value while creating flavors and textures that could make winter meals genuinely satisfying rather than merely adequate for maintaining life. They maintained the knowledge and resources necessary for brewing, for creating fermented beverages that provided not just calories, but also psychological benefits during the most difficult months. Alcoholic drinks that could ease the psychological stress of winter confinement, that could facilitate social bonding during community gatherings, that could provide warmth and comfort, that helped people endure conditions that tested every aspect of human resilience. But brewing required surplus grain, specialized equipment, controlled temperature conditions, and knowledge that represented significant investment of community resources in non-survival activities. They preserved foods in ways that enhanced, rather than simply maintained, nutritional value, creating winter meals that were genuinely satisfying rather than merely adequate. Techniques for smoking, drying, fermenting, and storing that required specialized knowledge, equipment, and materials that ordinary families couldn't afford to maintain. The difference between elite and common winter diet wasn't just abundance versus scarcity, but nutrition optimized for maintaining health and energy versus mere survival sustenance. But perhaps most significantly, they maintained the social networks that made such abundance possible. Elite families didn't just consume their own resources, they coordinated resource sharing among multiple households, managing complex systems of obligation and reciprocity that pooled community wealth in ways that benefited everyone, but benefited the coordinators most of all. These weren't simple economic relationships, but intricate social systems that required diplomatic skill, record-keeping abilities, and long-term relationship management that represented specialized labor requiring significant investment of time and intellectual energy. Winter was not just a season of physical survival, but a time when culture itself was maintained and transmitted. The long nights provided opportunities for storytelling, for the sharing of knowledge and values that held communities together across generations. But here too, elite status created different experiences and opportunities that reinforced existing social hierarchies while providing genuine community benefits. In Tadodaho's longhouse, winter evenings were spent not just in basic survival activities, but in sophisticated cultural work. Elders with decades of accumulated knowledge shared their understanding of history, politics, and spiritual matters with younger family members who would eventually assume leadership roles themselves. This wasn't casual conversation, but systematic education that required leisure time, physical comfort, and intellectual energy that families focused on basic survival simply couldn't spare. These weren't casual conversations, but systematic education that required leisure time, physical comfort, and intellectual energy that families focused on basic survival simply couldn't spare. Elite children learned not just practical skills, but the complex social and political knowledge necessary for community leadership. They received education that went far beyond basic survival skills to include sophisticated understanding of human nature, social dynamics, conflict resolution, and the subtle arts of persuasion and negotiation that effective leadership required. They memorized genealogies that stretched back generations, learning the intricate relationships and obligations that connected different families and clans. This genealogical knowledge wasn't abstract information, but practical intelligence that enabled sophisticated political maneuvering, understanding of alliance systems, and navigation of the complex social networks that determined how resources were allocated and decisions made during crisis periods. They studied the precedents and protocols that govern decision-making during crises, understanding the subtle negotiations required to maintain community cohesion when resources were scarce and tempers short. Leadership education that included understanding of human psychology under stress, techniques for managing group dynamics when survival was at stake, and strategies for making life or death decisions that community members would accept and support even when those decisions required significant personal sacrifice. Most importantly, they learned the art of leadership itself, how to make decisions that affected others' lives, how to balance competing interests, how to maintain authority while remaining responsive to community needs. This education happened during winter because winter provided the time and space for such learning, but it was only possible for families who had secured their basic survival needs well enough to invest in longer-term development. The stories told in elite households weren't just entertainment, but repositories of knowledge about everything from weather prediction to resource management to conflict resolution. They preserved the accumulated wisdom that enabled sophisticated governance, but they preserved it in forms that were accessible primarily to those who already held privileged positions. Cultural knowledge became another dimension of elite advantage, creating information asymmetries that reinforced existing power structures while providing genuine benefits to community welfare. Elite households maintained oral libraries of technical knowledge about agriculture, hunting, medicine, and environmental management that represented generations of accumulated expertise. This knowledge required not just memorization, but deep understanding that could only be developed through extended study and practical experience. The leisure time necessary for such education was itself a form of privilege that created expertise gaps between elite and common community members. But the knowledge preserved in elite households also served broader community interests. During crises, the accumulated wisdom maintained in leadership families became community resource. Understanding of historical precedents for managing particular kinds of disasters, knowledge of environmental patterns that could predict weather changes or resource availability, diplomatic expertise that could navigate conflicts with neighboring communities. These capabilities justified elite privilege by demonstrating its practical value for community survival. Yet privilege during winter came with costs that were often invisible to those who saw only the abundance and comfort. Elite status meant bearing responsibility for decisions that could determine whether community members lived or died. When resources ran low, it was leaders like Tadodaho who had to choose which families received additional support and which would have to endure even greater hardship, decisions that carried moral weight that abundance couldn't alleviate. These decisions carried psychological burdens that abundance couldn't alleviate. Knowing that your choices about resource allocation might condemn someone's child to starvation, that your judgment about winter's duration could doom families who trusted your leadership, that your management of community resources carried life or death consequences for dozens or hundreds of people. Elite leaders lived with the knowledge that their mistakes could have consequences far beyond personal hardship, that poor judgment or inadequate planning could result in community members dying from starvation, exposure, or the violence that sometimes erupted when survival resources became inadequate. The responsibility extended beyond resource allocation to social management during the most stressful period of the annual cycle. Winter brought communities into close quarters where personality conflicts could escalate into violence, where the psychological pressure of confinement and scarcity could fragment the social cooperation necessary for survival. Elite leaders had to manage these dynamics while maintaining their own psychological equilibrium, mediating disputes that could literally be matters of life and death, while projecting the confidence and stability that community members needed to maintain hope through the darkest months. Elite families also bore different kinds of physical risks. Their longhouses, larger and more elaborate, required more maintenance during extreme weather. When blizzards damaged structures that sheltered multiple families, elite leaders were often the ones who had to venture into dangerous conditions to coordinate repairs, to organize community labor for emergency construction, to make decisions about resource allocation when survival infrastructure was threatened. Their responsibilities often required travel during dangerous conditions, exposure to cold and exhaustion that their privileged position couldn't entirely mitigate. Diplomatic missions to negotiate with neighboring communities for resource sharing, hunting expeditions when stored, food proved inadequate, emergency travel to coordinate community response to crises. These activities required elite leaders to risk their lives in ways that their comfortable longhouses couldn't prevent. But perhaps most significantly, elite status made them targets during the worst moments of winter desperation. When community members were starving while leadership families maintained relative comfort, tensions could escalate into violence. Elite privilege was always contingent on community acceptance, and winter tested those relationships under conditions of maximum stress. Leaders who made unpopular decisions about resource allocation, who appeared to benefit too much from their privileged position during periods of general suffering, who failed to demonstrate adequate concern for community welfare, these individuals could find their comfortable winter quarters transformed into targets for community frustration and desperation. Haudenosaunee and others like him lived with the knowledge that their comfortable winter quarters could become prisons if community support eroded, that their stored abundance could make them victims rather than leaders if social order broke down under the pressure of extreme hardship. Elite privilege required constant negotiation and justification, continuous demonstration that concentrated resources served community interests rather than simple personal advantage. What emerges from examining elite winter experience is a more complex understanding of how leadership and privilege functioned in pre-contact native communities. These weren't simply hierarchical societies where some people had permanent advantages over others. Instead, they were seasonal democracies where leadership roles and resource access shifted according to changing community needs and environmental challenges. During summer and autumn, when resources were abundant and survival challenges manageable, leadership might be relatively informal and egalitarian. Decision-making processes that emphasized consensus building, resource distribution systems that prioritized broad equity, social relationships that minimized permanent hierarchy in favor of situational authority based on expertise and circumstance. The abundance of favorable seasons allowed communities to maintain social systems that prioritized equality and collective decision-making. But winter required different social technologies, concentrated authority, resource coordination, and decision-making systems that could function quickly and effectively under crisis conditions. The speed and decisiveness necessary for managing winter emergencies often conflicted with the deliberative processes that characterized more egalitarian governance systems. When immediate action could mean the difference between community survival and catastrophe, concentrated leadership became a survival technology rather than simply a social preference. Elite winter privilege wasn't just personal advantage, but investment in leadership capacity during the seasons when effective leadership made the difference between community survival and community collapse. The abundance maintained in elite households wasn't just consumption, but strategic reserve that could be mobilized for community welfare when circumstances required it. The sophisticated comfort systems that characterized elite winter quarters weren't just luxury, but infrastructure that maintained leadership capability during the period when leadership was most critical for community survival. But the system also created legitimate tensions between efficiency and equity, between the practical benefits of concentrated leadership and the human costs of systematic inequality. These tensions played out differently in different communities, with some developing more egalitarian approaches and others maintaining more rigid hierarchical structures. The balance between seasonal necessity and social justice remained a continuous challenge that communities had to navigate according to their own values, circumstances, and historical experience. Understanding these dynamics helps explain both the resilience and the vulnerability of pre-contact native communities. The social systems that enabled survival under extreme conditions also created internal divisions that could be exploited by outside pressures, advantages that could become weaknesses when traditional patterns were disrupted by colonization and cultural change. Elite winter privilege that served community survival under traditional conditions could become a source of vulnerability when external forces challenged established social patterns. As winter gradually yielded to spring, the relationships between elite privilege and community welfare faced their annual reckoning. How well had concentrated leadership served community needs? How fairly had resources been allocated during the months of scarcity? Which families had sacrificed most and which had benefited most from the social arrangements that governed winter survival? For leaders like Haudenosaunee, spring arrival brought both relief and evaluation. Communities that had survived winter intact could celebrate successful leadership, but communities that had suffered significant losses might question the decisions and resource allocations that had characterized the cold months. The effectiveness of elite privilege would be measured not just by leadership families' comfort, but by community survival rates, resource management efficiency, and the maintenance of social cooperation through the most challenging period of the annual cycle. Elite families who had maintained abundance while others endured genuine hardship faced complex social negotiations as traditional activities resumed. The privileges that had been accepted as necessary during crisis periods might seem less justifiable when survival was no longer in question. Spring councils, where community members could voice their assessment of winter leadership, where resource allocation decisions could be reviewed and evaluated, where the social contract that enabled elite privilege during winter could be renegotiated for the coming year. But spring also revealed the benefits of maintaining elite privilege through winter. Leaders who had preserved their health and energy through the cold months were better positioned to organize spring activities, planning, coordinating labor, managing the complex social and economic activities that would prepare the community for another cycle of seasons. The investment in leadership capacity during winter paid dividends in enhanced organizational capability during the critical spring period when communities had to mobilize for agriculture, hunting, and the resource accumulation that would determine the next winter's survival prospects. The knowledge preserved in elite households during winter's long nights became community resource as planting, hunting, and social activities resumed. The stories told around abundant fires became guides for practical decisions. The genealogies memorized during comfortable evenings became frameworks for organizing spring councils and summer gatherings. Cultural knowledge maintained in elite households during winter was redistributed to community benefit as seasonal activities resumed and social interaction expanded beyond survival necessities. In this way, elite winter privilege justified itself through spring productivity, demonstrating that the resources concentrated in leadership households during the cold months had been investments in community capacity rather than simply personal consumption. The sophisticated education that elite children received during winter evenings translated into leadership capabilities that served community interests. The social networks maintained through elite resource coordination became organizational infrastructure for spring and summer activities that benefited the entire community. Yet the justification was never complete, never permanent. Each winter created new tests of leadership effectiveness, new opportunities for community evaluation of elite performance, new challenges that could redistribute privilege and authority according to changing circumstances and evolving community needs. The seasonal democracy that characterized these communities meant that elite privilege had to be continuously earned and justified through demonstrated service to community welfare. As we prepare to drift away from these images of winter privilege, it's worth reflecting on what they reveal about the complexity of survival under extreme conditions. The comfortable longhouses, the abundant food stores, the sophisticated heating systems, these weren't just examples of inequality, but evidence of how human communities developed social technologies for managing scarcity and uncertainty under conditions that tested every aspect of human cooperation and ingenuity. Elite privilege during winter represented a community investment in leadership capacity, but it also created legitimate tensions between efficiency and equity that native communities navigated with varying degrees of success. Understanding these dynamics helps us appreciate both the achievements and the vulnerabilities of social systems designed for survival under conditions that tested every aspect of human cooperation. The balance between individual welfare and community benefit, between immediate equality and long-term survival, remained a constant challenge that required continuous negotiation and adjustment. The legacy of winter leadership patterns extended far beyond the cold months themselves, shaping community structures, family relationships, and cultural values in ways that influenced every aspect of life. The privileges maintained during winter created knowledge systems, social networks, and leadership capabilities that served communities throughout the seasonal cycle. The sophisticated education provided to elite children during winter evenings created leadership capabilities that served community interests during every season. But they also created dependencies, inequalities, and social tensions that made communities vulnerable to disruption when traditional patterns were challenged by environmental change, population pressure, or outside interference. The concentration of resources and knowledge in elite households created efficiencies during favorable conditions, but also created vulnerabilities when external forces challenged established social patterns. Perhaps most significantly, the winter elite experience reminds us that survival under extreme conditions requires social technologies as sophisticated as material ones. Communities that thrived through brutal winters did so not just because they developed effective techniques for staying warm and finding food, but because they created social systems that could maintain cooperation, coordination, and collective commitment even under conditions that tested every human relationship. The warmth of elite longhouses was more than physical comfort. It was investment in the social and intellectual resources that enabled entire communities to survive conditions that would have defeated individual families struggling alone. Whether such investments were justified, whether they served community welfare more than elite self-interest, remained questions that each community had to answer through its own experience, its own values, its own ongoing negotiation between survival needs and social justice. The sophisticated social systems that enabled winter survival represented remarkable achievements in human organization, technologies for managing resources and coordinating collective action that enabled communities to thrive under conditions that challenged every aspect of human endurance. But they also represented moral challenges that remain relevant today, questions about the relationship between individual privilege and community welfare, about the justification for inequality during crisis periods, about the balance between efficiency and equity in social organization. Winter always ended. But the social relationships forged during the cold months, the patterns of privilege and responsibility that emerged from seasonal scarcity, shaped communities long after the snow melted and abundance returned to the land. The legacy of winter leadership, both its achievements and its moral complexities, continued to influence community life through every season, creating social patterns that could enhance survival capability while also creating vulnerabilities that external forces could exploit. The longhouses that had provided warmth and comfort during the depths of winter became symbols of both community achievement and social inequality, evidence of human ingenuity in creating survival technologies, while also raising questions about the distribution of benefits and burdens that any successful community had to address. The stories told around elite fires during winter evenings became cultural resources that served community interests, but they also became instruments of social reproduction that could perpetuate privilege across generations in ways that might serve or challenge community welfare depending on changing circumstances and evolving values. As we drift toward the end of our journey through winter's hold on the early peoples of North America, let us pause in the gentle space between sleeping and waking, between the harsh cold of centuries past and the comfortable warmth of your present moment. We have walked through winter as it was lived, not as a romantic adventure or a dramatic survival story, but as the quiet, persistent reality that shaped entire civilizations. We felt the cold that settled into bones and stayed there for months. We witnessed the careful mathematics of survival that determined who would see spring and who would become winter's price. We explored the mysteries that time has buried and the privileges that scarcity made both necessary and troubling. But perhaps most importantly, we have glimpsed something profound about human resilience, the capacity to find not just survival, but meaning, community, and even beauty in conditions that would humble our modern understanding of what people can endure. Think for a moment about the distance we have traveled together. We began with you, lying beneath buffalo hides in a shelter that barely held back the killing wind, your breath forming ice crystals in the darkness, your body aching with cold that seemed to have no end. We walked with Otsenega through the long winter, watching her transform scarcity into sustainability through wisdom, patience, and an almost mathematical understanding of hope itself. We drifted through the archaeological silences that preserve the mysteries of techniques so sophisticated they transcended the need to leave physical traces, knowledge so complete it lived entirely in the successful practice of staying human under inhuman conditions. And we witnessed the complex dance of privilege and responsibility that allowed some to maintain warmth and abundance, while others counted each day's rations like prayers. What emerges from these stories is not just admiration for human toughness, but understanding of a different relationship with hardship itself. For the people we have been visiting in these cold landscapes, winter was not an interruption of normal life, but an essential part of the seasonal rhythm that gave life meaning and structure. They didn't survive winter in spite of their humanity, but because of it. The social bonds that held communities together during the worst cold weren't obstacles to overcome, but technologies as sophisticated as any material innovation. The patience required to endure months of scarcity wasn't passive resignation, but active practice of skills that made other kinds of abundance possible. Winter taught lessons that easy seasons couldn't provide. It revealed the true strength of social relationships, the real effectiveness of leadership, the genuine priorities that emerged when survival hung in the balance. Communities that survived brutal winters together possessed knowledge about cooperation, resource management, and collective endurance that no amount of individual preparation could match. But winter also taught humility. It reminded people annually that human cleverness, no matter how refined, remained dependent on forces beyond human control. The best preparation, the most careful planning, the strongest social bonds could still prove insufficient if winter chose to be particularly harsh or particularly long. This humility created different relationships with abundance when it returned. Spring harvests, summer gatherings, autumn preparations, all of these carried the memory of winter's lessons, the knowledge of how quickly plenty could become scarcity, how fragile the line between comfort and catastrophe. And as you rest now in your heated room, surrounded by technologies that make survival seem automatic, it's worth contemplating what we may have lost in gaining our modern insulation from seasonal hardship. Not that we should romanticize suffering or wish for a return to conditions that claimed so many lives, but perhaps we might consider what wisdom disappeared when winter stopped being a teacher that demanded our full attention and respect. The people whose stories we have shared tonight possessed knowledge about endurance, community, and the delicate balance between individual need and collective welfare that we may need more than we realize. They understood that survival was never purely individual, that the technologies that mattered most were social, that true security came not from accumulating resources but from building relationships that could withstand stress. They knew how to find abundance in scarcity, how to create warmth through cooperation, how to maintain hope through the kind of patient endurance that modern life rarely requires or rewards. They understood that some kinds of strength could only be developed through facing difficulty together, that some kinds of wisdom could only be learned through seasons that tested every assumption about what human beings could bear. But perhaps most importantly, they lived with constant awareness of the cycles that connected them to the natural world, not as victims of environmental forces beyond their control, but as participants in seasonal rhythms that gave life predictable structure and reliable meaning. Winter always ended, as it always will. But for the people we have been visiting, winter's end was never a return to exactly the same place they had occupied before the cold began. They emerged from each winter, changed, sometimes diminished by loss, sometimes strengthened by endurance, always carrying forward the lessons that only extreme conditions could teach. Spring's arrival carried different meanings when it had been genuinely uncertain, when survival had required conscious effort sustained across months of hardship. The first green shoots pushing through melting snow weren't just signs of seasonal change, but evidence that patience had been rewarded, that endurance had been sufficient, that the gamble of survival had paid off once again. Communities that experienced spring together after surviving winter together possessed bonds that abundance alone could never create. They had shared not just resources but the deeper communion of mutual dependence under conditions where cooperation meant the difference between life and death. The children who lived through these winters carried forward not just individual memories, but collective understanding of what human communities could accomplish when they functioned at their best. They learned resilience not as an abstract concept, but as daily practice, not as individual toughness, but as social technology that transformed individual weakness into collective strength. Tonight, as you settle toward rest, perhaps you can hear, in the modern silence, some echo of the wisdom these winter survivors developed through centuries of seasonal extremity. Not because we should try to recreate their hardships, but because we might benefit from remembering their discoveries about what makes life worth living when survival is never guaranteed. They learned to find satisfaction in simple warmth, profound pleasure in adequate food, genuine wealth in relationships that provided security no individual resource could match. They discovered that luxury was not abundance of possessions, but abundance of community, not having more than you needed, but knowing that others would share what they had when your own resources proved insufficient. They understood that the deepest human fulfillment came not from avoiding difficulty, but from facing it together, not from eliminating uncertainty, but from developing the skills and relationships necessary to navigate uncertainty with grace and mutual support. Perhaps most relevant for our time of environmental uncertainty and social fragmentation, they knew that sustainability was not a technical problem with technical solutions, but a social challenge that required wisdom about how to live within natural limits while maintaining the qualities that make life worth living. As our journey through winter's teachings draws to its quiet close, let yourself settle into the comfort that surrounds you now. Feel the warmth that requires no effort on your part. Taste the security that modern technology provides. Appreciate the abundance that makes survival seem effortless and automatic. But carry with you perhaps some small appreciation for the people who created entirely different kinds of abundance under conditions that tested every human capacity. Remember Otsenega, counting rations with mathematical precision while preserving community hope. Think of the anonymous builders whose snow shelters left no trace but kept families alive through months of killing cold. Consider the elite families who transformed privilege into responsibility, using abundance to maintain the social technologies that enabled entire communities to survive conditions that would defeat individual families struggling alone. Contemplate the mysteries that remain buried in archaeological silence, knowledge so sophisticated it transcended the need for physical artifacts, wisdom so complete it lived entirely in the successful practice of staying human under inhuman conditions. Their winters have ended, the cold that challenged them, the scarcity that tested them, the social bonds that sustained them, all have passed into the kind of historical memory that exists now only in stories like the one we have shared tonight. But spring always returned then, as it returns now, as it will continue to return long after our own winters have passed into memory. The cycles that connected them to the natural world continue. The seasonal rhythms that gave their struggles meaning still turn. The eternal promise that hardship is temporary, while resilience endures, still whispers through the darkness. Tonight, as sleep takes you into its own seasonal rhythm, perhaps you will dream of snow that sparkles under starlight, of fires that cast warm circles in winter darkness, of communities that discovered abundance in sharing rather than accumulating, strength in cooperation rather than competition. Dream of the patience that could endure months of cold without losing hope, the wisdom that could transform scarcity into sustainability, the social bonds that could turn individual survival into collective triumph. Dream of people who faced the worst their world could offer and found ways not just to endure, but to remain fully human in the process. Winter taught them well, spring rewarded their learning, summer celebrated their survival, autumn prepared them for the next test of everything they thought they knew about staying alive in a world that was both beautiful and dangerous, abundant and scarce, harsh and ultimately, reliably, kind enough to let them continue. Their story continues in every winter that ends, every spring that begins, every community that chooses cooperation over competition, endurance over despair, hope over fear. It continues tonight in the warmth that surrounds you, the comfort that cradles you, the security that allows you to rest without worry about tomorrow's survival. The winter they survived so long ago has finally, completely, gently ended. Its lessons live on in the quiet knowledge that humans working together with wisdom and patience can endure almost anything. Sleep now. Spring always comes, and in the morning you will wake warm, fed and surrounded by abundance they could barely imagine, carrying forward their greatest gift, the knowledge that we are capable of far more than we usually need to discover. The wind has stopped. The snow has melted. The cold has lifted. Rest well, travelers. Rest well. End of journey through winter's teachings. May your own seasons be gentle and may you carry forward the wisdom of those who endured the cold so that warmth would have meaning, faced scarcity so that abundance would have value, survived together so that community would have strength. Thank you for sharing this quiet moment with me. If you'd like more slow journeys like this, I post almost every day. There's another calm story waiting right here, or you can simply subscribe and drift along with our nighttime history community. Sleep well, and I'll see you soon.